year as Economic Club President, David has completed 133 interviews for a club today that has over 900 members. We can truly say, without exaggeration, that the Economic Club would not be what it is without David at the helm. So with a hearty round of well-deserved recognition and applause, let's all please welcome David to the stage as our extraordinary leader.
Thank you very much. For that undeserved standing ovation. What I wanted to do is, Carla is going to interview me in a few moments. I wanted to just set the stage by giving a little background that leads up to the book. So let me just say that first I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. I realize that I'm not as famous as many of the people we bring in for interviews, and I want to thank you for giving up your evening. And I want to thank all of you who helped make the club what it is. My experience with the club was, you're correct, I was asked by Ann Wexler, who was a member of the club who worked with me in the White House, if I would speak to the Economic Club of Washington. I said, okay, but I don't even know what it is. And so anyway, at the time it was small, I spoke. I wasn't invited back to speak again for the years ago. So some of you may wonder how I got to be the president of the Economic Club of Washington. I've wondered that myself many times. Like many elections in our country, there are back rooms that are smoke-filled, I guess, and that's how I got elected. What actually happened is I got a call from Vernon Jordan, who said that I come to see him in his office in New York. I've known Vernon for a long time. I said, okay. Went up to see him at his office at Lazard, and he said, David, I'm going to lock the door, and I'm going to make you sit here until you become the president of the Economic Club of Washington. And I said, well, what do you want? I don't really, not even a member. He said, that's not a problem. Ultimately, I agreed because he's a very persuasive person, and Vernon is the kind of person, many of you may know these kind of people, you can say no to them, but eventually you're going to say yes. So it's just easier to say yes in the beginning. They don't have to bother with saying no for a long time, then you get the yes. So I said yes, and then he said, Mary Brady takes care of everything, so you don't have to do anything. And so what actually, and she does. What actually happened, he said, all you have to do is get one business person a quarter, let them, get them, come in, you invite them, you know them, get them to come in, questions come up from the members, read the cards for the questions, and that's it, once a quarter. So I started doing that. I realized most of the business people who I knew were relatively boring speakers. And people were falling asleep, they're looking at their watches, they're kind of slipping out when nobody's looking. And then the questions came up for the members. Of course, these are old members, not the current members. And the questions weren't very good. So I pretended I was reading the questions, but I was making them up as I was going along. And they were funnier. So I ultimately went to the interview format, and as you heard, we've had a lot of them now. So let me just talk about three strands that lead to the book. One is interviewing. Second is my interest in philanthropy, which led to what we're going to talk about tonight. And then third is really my interest in history. So first, on interviewing. When I had a little background in it, so I'm not a professional interviewer. Andrea Mitchell is a professional interviewer, among other things, and thank you for coming, Andrea. What happened was I started at Carlyle to draw people to our events. I wanted to have big name speakers. Nobody wanted to hear David Rubenstein speak, certainly a long time ago, maybe not even now. So I would get former secretaries of state, former presidents of the United States to come as a draw. And they would come, and we paid them big fees, sometimes $200,000, $250,000 to speak, and they weren't that great. People were falling asleep. So eventually I said, well, what about if I just interview them and maybe make it easier and maybe livelier and wouldn't be people falling asleep? So I would go to their speaking agent and said, look, why don't I just interview them? And the agent would say, is it the same fee? I said, yes. Okay, same fee, we don't care. So So I would interview them, and got to be library and so forth. So when I got to the Economic Club of Washington, a year or 2 or 3 later, I felt comfortable doing some of the interviews, and it's fun to do it, and generally try to make it with some humor and so forth. And it's kind of thing that led to the Bloomberg show. Some of you may have seen it. And somebody who's a member of the club said to me, why don't you do this on television for Bloomberg? He's a member, he's in charge of the Bloomberg thing, Justin Smith. And I said, okay, I didn't really think it would happen. And then I talked to them and they said, okay, we're going to put it on. And I realize it's not 60 minutes, it doesn't have that big a viewing, but they do replay it 20 times a week. And it's everywhere all over the world, they give it to everybody. So anyway, I said, what's going to be the name of the show? And they said, we're going to call it the David Rubenstein Show. And I said, geez, I don't know if a long Jewish name is really going to work. Mike Bloomberg said it's not a problem. So I started doing this, and so I began doing these interviews, and I enjoy it, so it's been fun. And when people often ask me how I do it, I do read a lot, and I prepare, and I actually, write down the questions so I can kind of get it in my mind, and then I don't use notes. So there's nothing wrong with using notes, but I don't use them because I feel that when I do it, it's better to do it without notes. But you don't need, a lot of great interviewers do it with notes, so it's no problem. And so it worked out pretty well. So that's interviewing. How I came to be interviewer was luck, mostly Carla, then here, and then other places. And now I find that when I go around the world in various places, people come up to me and they only know me for interviewing. Some children or college kids or business students, they see me, they only think I do interviews. That's all they think I do. They don't know anything else. So it's okay, that's what I'm known for now. Let me talk a moment about philanthropy. And Carlyle, I started Carlyle, as some of you may know, with a couple other people in Washington in 1987. And it turned out that we got lucky. And I'll tell you what actually happened. We weren't qualified to start the firm. We didn't have a background really in this area. But I was propelled to do it because I read about 2 things that propelled me to do it. One, I read a man named Bill Simon, who had been Secretary of the Treasury in the Ford administration. He left, and Carter became president. I went to the White House. He did something called a leverage buyout, and he bought a company called Gibson Greeting Cards. He put $1 million in, and about 2.5 years later, he made $80 million. And I read about that, and I said, wait, that's better than practicing law, what I was doing. But I didn't know what a leverage buyout was. But I figured it was more profitable. So I went down the street to Bill Miller, who had been Secretary of Treasury in the Carter years, and said, your predecessor did a leverage buyout. He made $80 million. You must know what they are. I'll do legal work for you. I'll start a leverage buyout firm in Washington. He obviously knew I wasn't a good lawyer. He said no. And then ultimately, I asked a couple other people that they would join. We finally got it together. We raised $5 million at the start in 1987. And I was compelled to do it right then, because I read that an entrepreneur will start his or her first company between the age of 28 and 37. I read that when I was 37. I thought if I don't do it now, my chances are limited. So we started the firm, and we made a lot of mistakes in the beginning, but the reason we grew to be one of the largest in the world was really, we had a good track record, but it was really this. We came up with an idea that had changed the face of private equity. So the reason one of the largest private equity firms in the world is based in Washington was this idea we had. Private equity was a mom-and-pop business. The RJR deal done in 1989 by KKR, they only had 7 people in the firm in those days. They were very small firms because you were supposed to spend 100% of your time managing the fund you might have raised, the buyout fund or venture fund, whatever it was. You spent all your time on that. So we raised a $100 million fund at Carlyle. That's all we could raise, our first fund. And I told my partners, you do this. You manage that fund, and I will do something else. I will not ask my investors for permission to do this. I'll ask them for forgiveness later on. It's always easier to get forgiveness than permission. And the forgiveness will be this. I wasn't going to spend 100% of my time on that fund. I was going to try to create with my partners a fidelity of private equity, which would say have the buyout fund, the growth capital fund, the venture fund, the real estate fund, and then take our brand name and basically build a large organization investing in different areas, which hadn't been done before, and then go overseas and have European and Asian arms. And that was the novelty that enabled us to grow, and obviously other firms have done it now. So that's how we grew the firm. And then at one point, Forbes magazine, an article about my partners and me, and pointed out our net worth, which was pretty high by everybody's standards except Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. And so, when you have a lot of money, what are you going to do with it? So if I say to anybody here, I'm going to give you $100 billion tomorrow. You'll laugh for a moment. And then I said, you're going to have $100 billion. All right, so as soon as you have $100 billion, what are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to buy a plane, a boat, a couple of houses, some artwork, and then you got 90 so forth. But the same dilemma. You can basically do what the pharaohs did. You can be buried with it. You know, take your wealth and build a pyramid and you'll be buried with your wealth, but that's probably not a great idea. Second thing, you can just give it to your children, which is what most people historically have done. There's nothing wrong with that. And one of my children are here. Probably she would say that's a good idea, but there's no evidence that a child inheriting $1 billion necessarily goes on to win a Nobel Prize, but maybe they do. You never know. So then you get down to, well, you can give it away to good causes while you're alive. You can give it away later on after you pass away. And I wasn't sure when I passed away that I would be in a place where I would be able to see what the executive was doing. I was trying to give it away relatively soon. Then Bill Gates called me one day and said he didn't really know me then. He said, can I come to your office? And he came. And we had lunch, and he said he was going to start the giving pledge and so forth. And I said, okay, I'll be happy to be one of the first people joining. And we were 40 of us at the beginning. And so then, you know, historically, what you do when you have money, most people give it away to educational institutions and medical research and cultural institutions, and I've done that. But I happened that one thing happened by happenstance, and many things that happen in life that happen by happenstance are often the best things. If I hired McKinsey and said, what can I do with my money other than educational institutions and cultural institutions, they might have come back in 2 months or 2 years with a good report. What happened by happenstance? And here's what happened. As you heard, I was flying back, or a little bit about it, I was flying back from London to New York, actually. I was going back through my mail, and I saw that I was invited to a viewing of the Magna Carta. So wait a second, the Magna Carta must be in London. What's it doing in New York? It turns out, when I got there to go to the viewing of it, that there's 17 extant copies of Magna Carta. First ones were done in 1215. There were a couple other versions and so forth up through 1297. Of the 17 extant copies, one is in the Australian Parliament, and 15 are in British institutions, the British government, and so forth. And one was bought by Ross Perot in the early 1980s from a British family that had in its possession for roughly 500 years. They went land poor. They decided that they could either give up their land or give up the Magna Carta. They were saying, we'll give up the Magna Carta. Ross Perot went over, sent his lawyer to preempt the auction. He bought it for about $1 million or something. He rolls it up in a tube and goes back to British Customs. The customs agent says, what's in that tube? He said, oh, the Magna Carta. Oh, sure, go ahead. But they didn't get an export license, but actually that's what happened. So they put on that on the archives and for display. Then Ross Perot decided to sell it. And I was told that day that by the curator it would probably be sold to somebody that was from overseas. And I knew that the Magna Carta was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence, because the Magna Carta really had so many of the things that led to our Declaration of Independence. It had things like no taxation without representation, which of course led to the fight with the British. And so I thought one of these copies should stay in the United States. So I went back and resolved that I would buy it the next night. And it's a little presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta the next night, so I didn't tell anybody. I went back, and I wasn't really a person who went to Sotheby's that much. They put you in a little room, and they said, okay, you come here, and you're going to bid. So they put you in a room, and they put you in a telephone, and you start bidding. And if you've ever been to these auctions, any kind of auction, you get carried away, and eventually I started bidding. And then eventually they said, sold. So the head of Sotheby's came in and said, who are you? We never seen you. He said, you just bought the Magna Carta. You have the money for this? Yeah, I think so. So you can slip out the side door, and nobody will know who bought it, assuming you pay us. Or you can tell these 100 reporters who actually what you're going to do with it. And I said, I don't mind saying. So I went out and said, look, I came from very modest circumstances. My parents didn't graduate from college or high school. My father worked in the post office his entire life. He was a very lowly paid worker, and I got very lucky in my business career, so I'm going to give this to the United States government as a down payment on my obligation to give back to the country. And so I did that, and then that night I went to dinner at the President's Citicorp house, and Chuck Prince, and I said, I'm sorry I'm late, I just had to buy the Magna Carta. He didn't believe me, so the next day it was on the front page of the New York Times, and he said, David, I'm sorry I didn't take you seriously. Nobody's ever come to my house before and then bought the Magna Carta, so I didn't know what happened. So anyway, it's now there, and some of you may have seen it at the National Archives. And then what happened is this. I started getting calls from people saying, well, if you want to buy a Magna Carta for that price, I got one too. There was no other one. But I realized that I started being asked to buy other rare copies of Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment, which frees slaves. And I realized then that if you put these on display, the human brain is not yet so evolved that it won't, it will look at these things differently than if it looks on a computer slide. In other words, if you're on a computer slide and you see a copy of the Magna Carta, you know, you might just go with the next slide. But if you actually go and visit the real Magna Carta, you're probably going to be propelled to spend some time preparing for it by learning more about it. And or after you see it, you might be propelled to learn more about it. And so by having these historic documents on display, I thought maybe it would be a good idea to do this because people would maybe learn more about history. And then similarly, what happened was the earthquake we had in Washington affected the Washington Monument. The head of the Park Service was on the Kennedy Center board. I asked him how much it would cost to fix it, how long it would take. He said it would take a long time to get the money from Congress. That's what he said. It may not be true. And he said, I said, I'll tell you what, I'll put up the money. Don't worry about all the bureaucratic things. Just get it fixed. And then later he called me back and said, no, the Congress would like to put up half the money to share the credit. I said, okay, fine. So Congress did, and we fixed it, and it's now, of course, it has some problems, but now open. And then I realized the same thing is true with historic monuments. So the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial, other things, as they kind of fall to need some repair, if they're in better shape, more people will go to see them. More people go to see them, they'll prepare by learning more about the building before they go there or learn more afterwards. And why is this important? Well, here's the sad situation. STEM is very important in our country. We want STEM education, no doubt. But we've stopped teaching children civics very much, and we've stopped teaching them history. And as it was not stopped, but we don't teach them as much. We don't really have civics courses as much as we used to, and we don't have history courses as much as we used to. And the result is you can graduate from any college in the United States today without having taken an American history course. You can graduate from any college in the United States with a history major. Up to 80% of colleges has a history major without having taken an American history course. And the results are these. Right now, 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 1/3 of Americans cannot name 1 branch of government. Amazingly, 20-some% of Americans think that Larry Summers was the first Treasury Secretary. 10% of American college graduates think that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court. It's not the case. And a survey was done recently. Are there any naturalized Americans in this audience? Any naturalized Americans? Let me explain what you do. If you're a naturalized American, you take a citizenship test. You live in this country for 5 years, and then you pass it. You take a test. The test is 100 questions. Ask 60 of them if you're a naturalized American citizen, if you're sworn in. 91% of the people that take that test today, presumably with some studying, pass. The same test was given by a Woodrow Wilson Foundation to the citizens who were native born in all 50 states recently. And in 49 out of 50 states, a majority of native born Americans who took the test failed. Only one state, Vermont, they passed. Which shows you that people are not really know as much about history and so forth. And if they don't know much about history, you run into the problem that if you don't know as much about history, you don't know about your past, you might be likely to repeat the mistakes of the past. So one of the things I've been trying to do is to educate people a little bit more about history, do this through my philanthropy and other things. And this led to the thing we're going to talk about tonight, the book and the Library of Congress dialogues. And finally, I asked Carla if she would come up and we'll talk about how this led to the book, because it was a combination of my interest in interviewing, and interest in history, and interest in philanthropy that led to what we're going to talk about and what is in the book. So, Carla. She was given an introduction before, but let me just add to that by saying Carla was born in Florida, and but then moved to Chicago, and later she became the librarian at the city of Chicago, deputy librarian, and then became the chief librarian of my hometown library, the Enoch Pratt Library, which she was for 22 years. And then when President Obama was looking for someone to replace